They didn't wear flashy uniforms or march in formation. They operated from quiet offices at 8 Prince Albrecht Strasse in Berlin, where the blinds were always half raised, and the hallways smelled of damp paper and stale tobacco. Their power didn't come from armies or artillery. It came from something far more sophisticated and disturbing. The certainty that any word spoken too loudly could end up in a file, and that file could end your life. What few people know is that at the height of their expansion in 1944, the Geheime Staatspolizei, the Gestapo, had only 32,000 agents to monitor over 80 million citizens. A ridiculous ratio for any conventional police force, yet it functioned for 12 years with terrifying efficiency. The reason wasn't technological or military, it was psychological. They had managed to make German society police itself, making neighbors distrust neighbors and children doubt their parents. The machine that never slept, the internal control system. In January 1936, a Berlin administrative court issued a ruling that passed almost unnoticed among the German public, but it changed the legal foundation of all Nazi repression. The ruling was brief and categorical. The actions of the Gestapo were not subject to review by administrative courts. With these few words, the agency was formally placed above the law. It was not a police force acting within the legal framework. It was an entity that existed outside of it. A few weeks later, on February 10, 1936, a Prussian law consolidated that protection. The actions of the Gestapo were beyond judicial reach. By then, Heinrich Himmler had already been appointed head of all German police, absorbing the police, criminal, and public order forces of the entire country into the SS structure. The line between the black SS uniform and the badge of a civilian investigator disappeared. The unified system of fear was born. The building that housed the Gestapo at 8 Prince Albrecht Strasse had originally been a vocational school built in the 19th century with wide hallways, high ceilings, and rooms designed for study. From May 1933, these spaces were progressively converted into analysis offices, filing rooms, and interrogation offices. In the southern wing of the basement, from the summer of that same year, the so-called house prison, the Hausgefängnis, was set up. 39 individual cells and one common room that could never house more than 50 inmates at a time. The walls were uncoated concrete. The lighting was constant. Between 1933 and 1945, it is estimated that around 15,000 political prisoners passed through this basement, although exact records never existed with such precision because the system was not designed to be accountable. The names of nearly 3,000 of these prisoners are known today thanks to the partially recovered and catalogued archives by the Topography of Terror Foundation in Berlin. Other terror institutions operated in the same Prince Albrechtstrasse complex in a proximity that was no accident. The Hotel Prince Albrecht at number 9 housed the offices of the SS leadership. The Prince Albrecht Palais at number 102 Wilhelmstrasse became the headquarters of the SD under Heydrich's command in 1934. From September 1939, that same palace also hosted the headquarters of the newly created RSHA. In a few square blocks in the government center of Berlin, the most sophisticated architecture of terror the world had seen until then was literally concentrated. From these adjacent buildings, the persecution of political opponents, the forced Germanization of occupied territories, the murder of Soviet prisoners of war, and the logistics of the extermination of European Jews were planned. The backbone of this system was the file. Not the arrest, not the interrogation, the file. Everything began mundanely. A report would reach a local office, a Stapostelle, of which there were many in every major city of the Reich, from Berlin and Hamburg to Düsseldorf, Munich, Vienna, and Prague. These main offices were supplemented by smaller extensions called Nebenstellen, covering smaller cities and industrial areas. From each node, the reports would ascend to the central office in Berlin. The denunciation didn't need to be detailed. A single sentence was enough. Historical studies conducted decades later on the surviving archives from cities like Cologne, Düsseldorf, and Würzburg revealed that nearly 80% of the investigations initiated by the Gestapo stemmed from voluntary denunciations by ordinary citizens, not from intelligence operations, not from systematic surveillance, from neighbors, co-workers, family members, spouses. The suspect was then assigned a category, communist, religious agitator, racial enemy, moral saboteur. The file was linked with centralized records in Berlin and could be reopened months or years later if new information arose. It was, in essence, a latent threat with an indefinite expiration date. When the Reich Central Security Office, the RSHA, was created in 1939 under Reinhard Heydrich's command, the Gestapo became Office 4 within that structure. At its peak in 1944, the RSHA employed around 50,000 people. Of these, more than 31,000 were from the Gestapo, with nearly 13,000 additional personnel in the criminal police. The RSHA's headquarters employed about 3,500 people. While these numbers might seem impressive in the abstract, they become negligible when compared to the total population of the Reich, which in 1939 exceeded 80 million people, and the more than 100 million people under German control in the occupied territories during the height of its expansion. The Gestapo's power never lay in its size. It lay in its psychological architecture. Within the RSHA, the Gestapo was divided into sections with specific objectives. There was a section dedicated to communists and Marxists, another for churches and sects, another for Jews, another for Freemasons, another for homosexuals and asocials, another for racial enemies, and another specifically dedicated to monitoring potential disloyalty within the public administration itself. Each section had its analysts, interrogators, and direct links to the concentration camps and criminal police, the Kripo. The SD, the party's intelligence service, acted as a source of political intelligence, while the Gestapo retained executive authority. This separation between intelligence and police gradually blurred after the war began, especially in the Einsatzgruppen deployed in Poland and the Soviet Union, where SD agents and Gestapo officers operated together in the same mass extermination operations. The process was linear and mechanical. Once registered, the suspect could be summoned for questioning or detained directly under the legal figure known as Schutzhaft, protective custody. This measure, which theoretically sought to prevent disturbances, allowed in practice the indefinite imprisonment of anyone without formal charges, without a lawyer, and without the possibility of appeal. Those detained under Schutzhaft never saw a judge. They were not given documentation about the charges. The arrest order simply indicated, in standardized forms, suspected of hostile activities against the state. By the end of 1939, more than 12,000 people were interned in concentration camps under this legal figure. It wasn't punishment. It was a warning that could last the rest of the detainee's life. The most perverse aspect of the system was its administrative closure. In many cases, the detainee was given a document called Schutzhaftbefehl that they were asked to sign, declaring their voluntary wish to remain in custody. That signature, obtained after days of isolation, sleep deprivation, and accumulated psychological pressure, served to seal their own condemnation under the guise of legality. Bureaucracy was not an accident of the system. It was its essential component. It gave every act of terror the form of an ordinary administrative procedure and relieved officials of any personal moral responsibility by turning them into mere executors of forms. To send someone to a concentration camp, the Gestapo didn't need a judicial sentence. Standardized forms existed to order transfers under the category of dangerous element to the community. No judge was necessary. The court was the file. A mid-ranking official could decide the fate of a person with the same indifference as they stamped a leave request. In the Dachau, Buchenwald or Sachsenhausen camps, the Gestapo acted as the bureaucratic filter. It was the administrative entry into the concentration system. From Berlin, the RSHA received weekly reports with figures on detainees, types of ideological crimes detected, and results of interrogations. Repression was not reactive. It was planned, measured, and adjusted according to statistical parameters. If defeatist comments increased in a region, exemplary arrests would be intensified. If a wave of religious criticism was detected in a city, propagandistic responses were prepared, and the most active preachers were identified. Terror was preventive and adaptive, not random. In the Gestapo files recovered after the war, it was documented that by 1938, more than 2.5 million individual files had been recorded, a figure that reveals the scale of control not exercised through massive police presence, but through the permanent threat of already being registered. In a society where millions of people had no idea whether they had a file open in some drawer in Berlin, self-censorship became the most efficient form of obedience. Fear didn't need noise. It only needed the possibility of a file with your name on it. The three architects, Himmler, Heydrich, and Müller. Three men built the heart of Nazi terror. They were not trench soldiers or mass fanatics. They were managers, organizers, and technicians of fear. Among them, there was such a precise division of functions that some historians have compared it to a living organism. Himmler provided the ideological faith, Heydrich the analytical mind, and Heinrich Müller the administrative pulse that kept the machinery running day by day. Heinrich Himmler was born in Munich in 1900, the son of a Catholic school headmaster with pedagogical inclinations and a devotion prescribed by tradition. He studied agronomy, but his true obsession was order. Shy in nature, physically unimposing, sickly, and with an almost pathological mental rigidity, he found in National Socialism the perfect formula to channel his faith in discipline and racial purity. When he took command of the SS in 1929, the body had only a few hundred men. By 1933, it exceeded 50,000. For Himmler, the SS was not a paramilitary organization, but a modern chivalric order, meant to create a new aristocracy of Germanic blood. What is often overlooked about Himmler is that he was not a charismatic leader or a mass orator. His power lay in an astonishing memory, an iron bureaucratic discipline, and a capacity to convince subordinates that the impossible was merely a matter of method and will. Every member of the SS had to swear personal loyalty to Adolf Hitler, not to the state or the nation. This almost mystical bond turned the organization into the most efficient instrument of German totalitarianism. After the purge of the SA in the so-called Night of the Long Knives, between June 30th and July 2nd, 1934, Himmler gained total control of the political police. 2 years later, he was appointed Reichsführer SS and head of the German police, subordinating regional authorities under a single command. In practice, every commissioner, every investigator, and every camp guard now answered to him. His deputy, Reinhard Heydrich, was his complementary opposite. Born in 1904 in Halle an der Saale into a family of musicians, his father, Bruno Heydrich, was a composer and director of a conservatory. Heydrich was everything Himmler was not physically. Tall, with marked Nordic features, elegant, and with a cold intelligence that his contemporaries described as almost surgical. He had joined the Imperial German Navy in 1922, but was expelled in 1931 after a love scandal involving the daughter of a shipyard director. Unemployed and with his military career cut short, Himmler recruited him into the SS after an interview in which Heydrich, in just 20 minutes, outlined from memory the framework of an intelligence service that Himmler had just asked him to design. That organization became the SD, the Sicherheitsdienst, the party's intelligence service. In a few years, Heydrich had created a filing system that covered everyone from communist leaders and unionists to priests, homosexuals, liberal-minded writers, and citizens who had simply made an inappropriate joke about Hitler in a bar. By the age of 30, he had catalogued tens of thousands of people based on their usefulness or danger to the Reich. In his reports, each individual was reduced to a category, and each category corresponded to a specific procedure. For Heydrich, humanity could be reduced to files, statistics, and typewritten orders. His collaborators described him in terms that mixed admiration and terror. He spoke during meetings with a clinical coldness that froze the room. "It's not about punishment," he said, "but about preventing doubt from being born." His office at Prinz Albrechtstrasse in Berlin was the nerve center of bureaucratic terror. From there flowed arrest authorizations stamped with indifference, typewritten deportation orders, and execution instructions written in the antiseptic language of administration. Adolf Hitler called him the man with the heart of iron. Some of his own officers claimed he could order the death of 100 people and play the violin an hour later at a gala dinner. On May 27, 1942, in Prague, two Czechoslovak agents trained in Britain, Josef Gabčík and Jan Kubis, members of Operation Anthropoid, threw a grenade at Heydrich's open Mercedes on the curve of Holsovičkách. The shrapnel hit his spleen and spine. He died of septicemia on June 4th. The reprisal was ruthless. The village of Lidice was completely destroyed, its men shot, its women sent to concentration camps, and its children dispersed or gassed. Thousands of other Czechs were executed in the following weeks. His funeral in Berlin was a politically orchestrated cult event led by Himmler. The third architect was the most anonymous and, paradoxically, the most operationally feared. Heinrich Himmler was born in 1900 in Munich into a lower middle-class family. Unlike Himmler and Heydrich, he had no university education nor declared ideological fervor. He was a pure bureaucrat, a technician of power. He began his career as an aviation mechanic during World War I, piloting artillery observation planes on the front lines. After the war, he joined the Munich police, where he participated in suppressing communist uprisings in Bavaria, developing a visceral hatred of Marxism that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The most striking aspect of Müller's rise is that he wasn't even a member of the Nazi Party initially. During the Weimar Republic, he was considered close to the Bavarian People's Party, a conservative Catholic party. When Hitler came to power, Müller called for a hardline stance against supporters of the new chancellor. This apparent contradiction did not go unnoticed. However, Himmler saw an advantage in it. A Gestapo chief without party militancy could carry out police actions with greater discretion, unbound by visible party loyalties. He did not officially join the NSDAP until 1939, by which point he was already in charge of the organization. By then, the short, stocky Bavarian with a square head, piercing eyes, and thin lips had risen through the ranks of the SS with membership number 107.043. His nickname, Gestapo Müller, had become legendary within the repressive apparatus. It was said that he knew the names of every field commander, every regional head, and every relevant political prisoner. His obsession was administrative order. "Without papers, there is no state," he would often repeat to his officers. No arrest, no deportation, no execution was to be without its corresponding form. Among the three, the model of terror they built did not depend on visible violence, but on predictability. It wasn't necessary for the Gestapo to be everywhere. It was enough for everyone to believe that it could be. Himmler's ideological faith, Heydrich's analytical mind, and Müller's administrative pulse were articulated in a system where millions of people obeyed without anyone directly pointing a weapon at them. Their greatest achievement was not terror. It was the obedience that terror produced before it even needed to be exercised. The map of the enemies, who the Gestapo pursued and why. In the Third Reich, no one was safe from becoming an enemy of the state. It was not necessary to commit a crime or plan a conspiracy. It was enough to fit, even marginally, into one of the categories of suspicion that the regime had designed with chilling meticulousness. The Gestapo did not only pursue actions, it pursued profiles, and these profiles could expand without limit whenever the regime needed them to. The first targets were organized political opponents. After the Reichstag fire on the night of February 27, 1933, officially attributed to a communist conspiracy, the emergency decree enacted the next day suspended fundamental rights and allowed arrests without judicial warrants. Within weeks, more than 10,000 members of the German Communist Party, KPD, were arrested. KPD leaders disappeared into secret prisons. Thousands of grassroots militants were sent to Dachau, which opened on March 22, 1933, or to places like Oranienburg and Columbia House in Berlin, where prisoners wore red triangles sewn onto their uniforms. By the end of that year, more than 80,000 opponents had been detained, and at least 600 had died in custody. However, repression soon exceeded the boundaries of active political engagement. By 1935, the Gestapo was no longer focused exclusively on those who openly conspired, but also on those who had ever been affiliated with banned organizations. The simple possession of a social democratic pamphlet, an old union subscription, or a letter mentioning contact with political exiles could lead to detention. Loyalty, according to the implicit code of the regime, had to be constantly demonstrated. Passive neutrality was interpreted as latent opposition. The largest category in the long term was that of racial enemies. Jews, initially persecuted through gradual economic and civil exclusion, were relabeled in the mid-1930s as a biological threat to the body of the nation. Since 1935, the Nuremberg laws for the protection of German blood and honor made sentimental or sexual relationships between Jews and German citizens a crime under the term Rassenschande, racial defilement. The Gestapo intervened in these cases based on denunciations from neighbors. Being seen greeting a person of Jewish origin too affectionately, or having maintained correspondence considered intimate could trigger an interrogation, a file, and ultimately deportation to a camp. From September 1941, all Jews over the age of 6 in the Reich were required to wear the yellow star, which made them permanently visible targets for any informant. At the same time, the Gestapo created the category of asocials, perhaps the most arbitrary of all. Under this term were grouped beggars, vagrants, chronic alcoholics, sex workers, long-term unemployed individuals, and people deemed incapable of adapting to the Reich's productive pace. In 1938, the action Arbeitsscheu Reich, action against the Reich's work shyness, was executed, during which thousands of people were detained for alleged indiscipline or social uselessness. They were sent to the camps with a black triangle and classified as disposable subjects. They were not accused of specific crimes but of parasitizing the national community. Their crime was existing in an unproductive manner in a state that defined human value in terms of racial and labor utility. The repression of homosexual men was structured through Article 175 of the Penal Code, which criminalized relations between men. Although this article had existed since 1871, the Nazis reactivated it with unprecedented ferocity. They were accused of weakening the moral strength of the German body and of creating emotional bonds that could challenge the military hierarchy. Between 1933 and 1945, more than 100,000 men were arrested under this article, of whom between 5,000 and 15,000 were sent to concentration camps wearing the pink triangle, the most stigmatized emblem within the concentration system. There, they were subjected to especially harsh punishments, considered depraved by voluntary choice, not by biological imposition, which placed them at the lowest rung of the internal hierarchy of the camps. Jehovah's Witnesses represented a peculiar category. They were neither politically subversive nor racially defined as enemies, but they refused to swear loyalty to Hitler, carry weapons, or participate in any political structure of the regime. Their simple refusal to give the Heil Hitler salute was enough to have them denounced. Around 10,000 were arrested, many deported to camps with the purple triangle. Their case clearly showed that in a totalitarian state, it was not enough to be apolitical. Not actively supporting the regime was equivalent to challenging it. As the war progressed, the map of enemies incorporated a more diffuse but quantitatively explosive category: the so-called Schwarzhörer, listeners of foreign radios, and those who expressed defeatist comments. Listening to the BBC or Radio Beramünster was considered a political crime. Saying aloud that the war was lost could be prosecuted as Wehrkraftzersetzung, destruction of defensive strength. Denunciations for such comments multiplied exponentially starting in 1943, when news from the Eastern Front began to deteriorate. The accused did not receive judicial defense. Their fate depended solely on the evaluation of the Gestapo agent reviewing their file. What made this system of categories especially effective was its constant expansion. As political control solidified, the external and visible enemy gave way to the internal and diffuse enemy. An individual could be considered dangerous simply because of their attitude, their manner of speaking, or their silence at an inappropriate moment. No one knew exactly what behavior would place them under suspicion. And that uncertainty was deliberate. Suspicion was not the result of an investigation, it was its starting point. The room without windows, interrogations, torture, and the art of breaking the will. The basement of number 8 Prince Albrechtstrasse did not appear on any official building plan. It had isolation cells approximately 2 meters by 1.5 meters, uncoated concrete walls, a light bulb permanently on the ceiling, and a wooden cot without a mattress. There were no windows. The temperature in winter hovered around 4 degrees Celsius. It was here that, for many detainees, the process the Gestapo called verschärfte Vernehmung, intensified interrogation, began. A bureaucratic euphemism that required several pages of internal regulations to define when and how it could be applied. Because this is what distinguished the Gestapo from other secret police forces of the time. Torture was codified. It was not a passionate overflow of frustrated agents. It was a procedure with stages, authorization forms, and limits that were systematically ignored but existed on paper. On June 12, 1942, Himmler issued an internal directive outlining the conditions under which intensified interrogation could be applied. When there was well-founded suspicion that the detainee was hiding information about terrorism, sabotage, or contacts with the enemy. The directive specified that it had to be approved by the regional Gestapo chief and reported to Berlin. In practice, the approval was an automatic formality, and the report was a formality that was ignored. The system of accountability existed to provide documented impunity. The interrogation process followed a calculated progression. It did not begin with physical violence. It began with isolation. The detainee was placed in a solitary cell without contact with other prisoners, without information about formal charges, and without access to legal representation. Sleep deprivation was the first tool. The interrogators alternated in shifts of only a few hours to keep the detainee awake for days. Food was reduced to black bread and water. After 48 to 72 hours in these conditions, most people showed signs of disorientation and acute distress, which the interrogators recognized as the optimal moment to begin formal sessions. During the initial sessions, the agent did not accuse directly. He would insinuate that he already knew everything, that the confession was a formality, and that cooperation could lead to more favorable treatment. It was a psychological technique that often worked without the need for advancing to violence. Reinhard Heydrich had documented in an internal report from 1936 that most detainees revealed relevant information before any physical contact began, simply due to the certainty that the state's apparatus already had their complete file and that resisting was futile. The perception of omniscience was more effective than a beating. The interrogations followed a standardized process documented in the files of the Rote-Kapelle case. The first sessions were recorded using devices like the Lorenz textophone, a tape recording machine that produced a transcribable written document. Days or weeks later, a judge or prosecutor would conduct a second, shorter session to ratify the initial statement. At the end of the process, the detainee had to sign a statement that included the phrase, "I stand by my statements before the secret state police. They are truthful, and I make them part of my judicial hearing today." This phrase, spoken or signed after days or weeks of physical and psychological pressure, was presented as voluntary testimony in court. The gap between the reality of the interrogation and its official transcription was the abyss where justice ceased to exist. When psychological persuasion failed, the second stage began. The physical methods documented in later testimonies and the Nuremberg trials included specific techniques that Gestapo interrogators had perfected. One of these was known as the swing. The detainees' hands were tied behind their knees, and their body was suspended face down from a ladder in a position that caused progressive muscle tears and shoulder dislocations after a few hours. Another documented method involved inserting small wooden slats between the fingers of the hand and squeezing them until fractures occurred. Submarines in bathtubs with freezing water, the application of electric current to hands, genitals and ears, burns with cigarettes on fingertips, and systematic blows with rubber truncheons on the back, thighs and soles of the feet completed a repertoire that interrogators exchanged according to the detainee's profile and the urgency of the information sought. The survivor Jean Améry, a Belgian writer and resistance fighter detained by the Gestapo in July 1943 in Brussels, was transferred to the Breendonk fortress and later to Auschwitz. He described years later in his work Beyond Guilt and Atonement that the first blow received during the interrogation destroyed something that never returned, the belief that the world could be a place where physical integrity was inviolable. Torture, Améry wrote, was not only physical pain. It was the demonstration that the other could turn your body into their instrument without any law or another human being intervening. It was the destruction of trust in the world as a shared space. The declared goal of the interrogation was not to punish but to obtain useful information. But in practice, many interrogations continued long beyond any informational usefulness. The Rote-Kapelle case files documented that interrogators like criminal secretary Alfred Göpfert also used sophisticated methods of deception. They introduced Gestapo secretaries disguised as detainees to win the trust of female prisoners and obtain denunciations that they had not yielded under physical pressure. Libertas Schulze-Boysen, wife of Harrow, underwent this procedure. A secretary named Gertrude Breiter pretended to be a companion hostile to her superiors, gained Libertas's trust, and led her to reveal names and contacts under the illusion of speaking to an ally. The deception was so effective that Libertas attempted to use Breiter to warn her comrades, sealing her fate. The Gestapo also used threats against third parties as an instrument of pressure. Telling a man that his wife had been detained, that his children could be sent to state-run homes, or that his elderly father would be invited to testify, often produced more results than direct violence. This technique was especially effective with detainees who had family within the reach of the state. After the July 20, 1944 assassination attempt, Himmler institutionalized this logic through the figure of Sippenhaft, blood guilt, which established that the families of conspirators could also be arrested. Dozens of wives, children, and parents of the conspirators were detained in the weeks following the failed assassination, not for participating in any plot, but simply for being related by blood to those who had attempted it. Some detainees managed to avoid the worst treatment through denunciation. A name, an address, a detail about a clandestine meeting could mean the difference between being sent to a concentration camp or receiving a formal warning and being released under surveillance. This perverse mechanism ensured that every interrogation potentially generated new files, new arrests, and new sessions. The system fed itself. A resistance network that historians estimate never exceeded a few hundred active members in some cities could generate dozens of chain investigations from a single detainee who gave in under pressure. The confessions obtained under these conditions were recorded, transcribed, and archived. The detainees were then forced to reread their statements and confirm them before an official, creating a documentary trail that the court used as evidence. The procedural system turned torture into proof. The judges of the Volksgerichtshof, the People's Court, did not ask how the confession had been obtained. They read the document, listened to the terrified defendant, and pronounced the sentence the regime expected. The outcome was predictable even before the trial began. What post-war records reveal most clearly is that the Gestapo was not an organization of systematic sadists. It was a bureaucracy that had normalized violence to the point where it became indistinguishable from ordinary administrative work. The same officials who processed Jewish deportation files in the morning had lunch in the building's cafeteria and in the afternoon supervised an interrogation session before returning home to their families. Terror was their job, and like any job, it became routine. The eye that never sleeps. Society as a surveillance network. One autumn afternoon in 1941 in Würzburg, a middle-aged woman went to the local Gestapo office to denounce her husband. She didn't accuse him of belonging to any clandestine organization or sabotaging war production. She accused him of having said at the dinner table that the campaign in Russia would end badly for Germany. The husband was summoned, interrogated for 2 days, and released with a formal warning. His file remained open. 3 months later, when he repeated a similar comment in front of a neighbor, he was arrested again. This time he did not return home. This case, documented in the Gestapo files from Würzburg studied by historian Robert Gelateli in the 1990s, was not an exception. It was the normal functioning of the system. Gelateli's study of these files revealed that approximately 73% of the cases processed by the local Gestapo had been initiated by voluntary denunciations from citizens, not by intelligence operations, not by undercover surveillance, not by infiltrators, by neighbors, co-workers, acquaintances, and family members who, for a variety of reasons, decided to write a letter or show up in person at an office. The motivation behind these denunciations was rarely pure ideological fanaticism. The researchers who analyzed the files found a much more mundane and disturbing panorama. Many denunciations arose from pre-existing personal conflicts, inheritance disputes, workplace rivalries, revenge for infidelities, envy between competing merchants. The regime had provided a moral language that allowed private conflicts to be transformed into patriotic acts. Accusing someone of being a defeatist, a hidden communist, or morally corrupt was enough to activate the investigation mechanism. Once a name was handed over, the Gestapo decided whether or not to open a file, but the suspect had already entered the state's radar. Their social reputation was marked regardless of the outcome. The gender percentages in the denunciations revealed specific patterns. Approximately 80% of the denunciators were men. However, women who denounced did so disproportionately against their own partners. Many of these denunciations did not arise from ideological loyalty, but from situations of domestic violence or abandonment. A woman who had been beaten or deceived had no effective legal channels to protect herself, but she could denounce her husband for criticizing Hitler at home. Private violence did not justify state intervention, but political dissent did. The regime had inadvertently created a mechanism that some women used as a survival tool within abusive marriages. The children indoctrinated by the Hitler Youth, the Hitler Jugend, represented another fracture within the household. The organization instilled in its members the idea that loyalty to the Führer surpassed any family bond. There were documented cases of teenagers denouncing their own parents for critical comments overheard at home. In some of these cases, the Nazi state was forced to tone down. It processed the father, but tried not to publicize the fact of the filial denunciation so as not to fuel the image of a completely fractured society. Family cohesion was, paradoxically, a propaganda asset that the regime could not destroy entirely without eroding its own image. In the workplace, the dynamic was equally corrosive. Factories, offices, and workshops became environments where every conversation was potentially dangerous. Business directors had the implicit obligation to report suspicious behavior among their employees. Foremen acted as information gathering points. A worker who expressed doubts about rationing policy, arrived late too often, or showed little enthusiasm during Hitler's radio speeches could receive a work report that ended up in a Gestapo file. The difference between an ordinary disciplinary sanction and a political denunciation was often just a matter of wording. The Gestapo strategically reinforced the myth of its omniscience through calculated appearances. Officers would occasionally show up at cafes, trams, and movie theaters without making any arrests, simply observing. Stories about people being arrested for whispered comments in supermarket lines were allowed to circulate. Some of these stories were true, many were exaggerations. All served the same purpose: to keep doubt alive. Social paranoia turned every conversation into a calculated act. Many citizens ended up self-censoring even when alone for the irrational but understandable fear that someone might be listening behind a thin wall. The most profound effect of the system was not the number of people arrested, but the quality of the silence it produced. In many homes, parents taught their children to repeat the regime's slogans in public with apparent enthusiasm while privately whispering to them not to take them seriously. In other homes, on the contrary, parents feared that their own children, completely absorbed by the ideology of the youth groups, would denounce them for lack of visible enthusiasm. Trust ceased to be an emotional refuge. It became a transaction of calculated risk. Studies of German society during this period show that most citizens never needed direct contact with the Gestapo to modify their behavior. The mere possibility that there might be a file with their name on it in some drawer in Berlin was enough to shape their words, gestures, and silences. Historian Detlef Peukert, in his research on daily life in the Third Reich, described this phenomenon as preventive obedience, the voluntary modification of behavior before any concrete threat existed. The regime had accomplished something that no police force with infinite resources could have achieved by force. It had installed the state inside the mind of every citizen. The result was a society that policed itself with an efficiency that no police body could replicate. The Gestapo did not need agents on every corner. It had them. It called them citizens. Exported terror, the Gestapo in the occupied territories. On March 12, 1938, German troops crossed the Austrian border. The Anschluss, the annexation of Austria to the Reich, was completed in less than 48 hours without a single shot being fired. That same afternoon, as the Viennese crowds welcomed Hitler with flowers in Heldenplatz, Heinrich Himmler flew to Vienna with a specific mission: to establish the Gestapo infrastructure before the enthusiasm of the masses could dissipate. There was no time to lose. Terror had to be instilled before anyone had the chance to organize. What occurred in Vienna during the weeks following the Anschluss was, according to the archives studied by historians Walter Manoschek and Hans Safrian, one of the most brutal and accelerated episodes of the Nazi repressive system implementation. In less than 2 weeks, over 76,000 Austrians were arrested. The Vienna Gestapo, the Gestapo-Dienststelle Wien, headed by Franz Josef Huber, a close collaborator of Müller, operated from the Hotel Metropole in Mordzinplatz, a 5-story building whose rooms were converted into interrogation offices and makeshift detention cells. The hotel's basements concentrated an activity that its previous guests could never have imagined. The smell of industrial disinfectant mixed with the sweat of the detainees permeated the hallways for years. The first targets in Vienna were the Jews, who represented 10% of the city's population, and the Austrian political opposition. But the difference from what had occurred in Germany between 1933 and 1938 was the speed. In the German Reich, persecution had been a gradual process over years. In Austria, it was concentrated into weeks. Adolf Eichmann, then a relatively low-ranking SD official who arrived in Vienna in August 1938 as an Untersturmführer, established the Central Office for Jewish Emigration in the Palais Rothschild, whose purpose was to force emigration through a combination of property confiscation, institutionalized extortion, and the threat of internment in camps. In less than 18 months, this office processed the forced emigration of over 100,000 Austrian Jews, a model that Heydrich considered so efficient that he ordered it to be replicated across the Reich. The expansion into the occupied territories, starting in September 1939, transformed the Gestapo into a multinational control force. In Poland, the Gestapo operated alongside the Einsatzgruppen, mobile special operation units made up of SS members, the SD, and police, who advanced behind the regular army with the mission of eliminating the Polish political, intellectual, and military elite. This operation, known as Intelligence Action, was planned even before the invasion began. By January 1940, over 60,000 Poles had been executed. University professors, priests, doctors, army officers, and municipal officials disappeared in a systematic decapitation of Polish civil society that the German occupiers euphemistically called extraordinary pacification. In France, after the defeat of June 1940, the Gestapo set up its headquarters in Paris at 84 Avenue Foch, which the Parisians soon renamed the Avenue of Pain, and at 11 Rue des Saussets. These two facilities became the nerve centers of terror in occupied France. The methods applied there differed little from those used in Germany: isolation, sleep deprivation, physical interrogations. But the context was different. The agents operated in a foreign country without the network of voluntary informants that they had in Germany. They needed to build this network from scratch. They succeeded through a combination of bribery, blackmail, and the use of French collaborators who, for ideological or pragmatic reasons, facilitated information about resistance networks, hidden Jews, and Allied fugitives. The case of the Netherlands illustrates with precision the efficiency of the exported system. When the German forces occupied the Netherlands in May 1940, the Gestapo set up its regional headquarters in The Hague. The persecution of the Dutch Jews, who represented 1.6% of the population, reached a deportation rate of 73%, one of the highest in Western Europe. Historians have attributed this efficiency in part to the high degree of administrative registration that already existed in the Netherlands: detailed municipal rolls, records of religious identity, and resident files that the Gestapo inherited and used as an operational database without having to build them from scratch. The Dutch administrative apparatus, designed to manage a peaceful society, became an extermination tool in the hands of the occupiers. In Bohemia and Moravia, the protectorate established in March 1939, Reinhard Heydrich assumed the position of Reich protector in place of Konstantin von Neurath in September 1941. What Heydrich implemented there was a concentrated and accelerated version of his repressive model. In the first 2 weeks of his mandate, he ordered the execution of over 300 people considered dissenters and handed over the files of another 1,200 for processing by the Gestapo. But he also applied the carrot and stick logic with characteristic coldness. While exterminating the resistance, he increased food rations for Czech workers in the armaments industry and established labor benefits designed to reduce passive resistance. acts of sabotage dropped by 73% in less than 6 months. Heinrich recorded it as a management success. The Gestapo also operated on the Eastern Front with a brutality that surpassed all previous parameters. The Einsatzgruppen, directly coordinated from the RSHA by Heinrich and operationally supervised by Müller, were instructed to advance alongside the regular army and eliminate the dangerous elements in each captured town. This term included Soviet political commissars, Communist Party officials, Jews, and anyone deemed capable of organizing resistance. The methods of mass execution in mass graves, like those at Babi Yar near Kiev, where between September 29th and 30th, 1941, 33,771 people were murdered in 2 days, were documented in the Einsatzgruppen's own internal reports, which Müller ordered to be regularly sent to Hitler. What these operations in the occupied territories revealed was the flexibility of the Gestapo's repressive model. In Germany, the system depended on the voluntary participation of a society that knew the rules of the game. In the occupied territories, where this complicity did not exist or had to be built, the Gestapo more quickly resorted to direct and mass violence. But the goal was always the same: to install fear on a scale sufficient to make organized resistance unthinkable for the majority. In some territories, they succeeded. In others, they failed. But the mechanism, the combination of meticulous bureaucracy and exemplary terror, was consistent from the streets of Berlin to the villages of Belarus. The ones who dared. Resistance against the Gestapo. On July 20th, 1944, at 12:42 p.m., a bomb placed inside a briefcase exploded in the conference room of the Wolfschanze, Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia. Klaus von Stauffenberg, a colonel in the general staff who had lost his right hand, 2 fingers from his left hand, and his left eye during the Battle of Kasserine in 1943, had placed the briefcase less than 2 meters from the Führer before leaving the room under a pretext. Hitler survived because Colonel Heinz Brandt, unknowingly, moved the briefcase with his foot to get it out of the way, placing it on the other side of the solid oak leg of the conference table. That leg absorbed part of the blast. Hitler emerged with scorched pants, a perforated eardrum, and conjunctivitis. 4 people died. The conspirators, who were waiting in Berlin for the announcement of his death to execute the coup plan known as Operation Valkyrie, lost their window of opportunity in the indecision of the first hours. But to understand the resistance against the Gestapo, we must go back much earlier than July 20th. Organized opposition began almost simultaneously with the regime itself, and its history is one of people who clearly understood what was being built while the majority either ignored or preferred to ignore it. The first to try to organize were the Communists and Social Democrats who had not been arrested in the 1933 purges. They operated in tight-knit cells of 3 to 5 people who communicated through physical messengers and clandestinely printed materials. The German Communist Party maintained a clandestine network known as the KPDU that distributed leaflets in factories in Berlin, Hamburg, and the Ruhr until well into 1935, when the systematic infiltration of the Gestapo dismantled most of its structures. The Gestapo fought these networks by infiltrating directly. Undercover agents posed as disgruntled workers or militants seeking to reconnect with the organization. Once inside a cell, it only took weeks to identify all its members. The cell structure was an attempt to limit the damage. If a member was arrested, they theoretically only knew the other 2 or 3 members of their immediate cell. In practice, under torture, many ended up revealing more than they should have known. The Gestapo also used conditionally released detainees as involuntary informants. They would let them go, watch them, and wait for them to contact their comrades. The network known as Rotkapelle, the Red Orchestra, represented one of the most sophisticated attempts at resistance and also one of the most tragic. It was actually an umbrella term used by the Gestapo to refer to several pro-Soviet espionage networks operating in Germany, Belgium, France, and the Netherlands. In Germany, the core group included Harro Schulze-Boysen, a Luftwaffe lieutenant with access to high-level strategic information, and Arvid Harnack, an economist with contacts in the Reich Ministry of Economics. Both transmitted information to Moscow about German military plans, including details about Operation Barbarossa months before its launch. In 1942, Heinrich Himmler successfully infiltrated the network using intercepted radio signals and a captured communications operator whom they forced to continue transmitting under supervision. Schulze-Boysen was arrested on August 31, 1942. Harnack and his wife, Mildred, an American citizen, were detained on September 7th while vacationing in the Curonian Spit. Schulze-Boysen and Harnack were hanged with piano wire on December 22nd of that year in Plötzensee prison. Mildred Harnack was guillotined on February 16, 1943, the only American citizen executed by direct order from Adolf Hitler. Of the more than 100 members identified from the network, over 50 lost their lives. Resistance within the army itself had a longer and more tortuous history. The Abwehr, the military intelligence service headed by Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, had become what historian Michael Burley described as the only state organism where internal resistance could develop with some continuity. Canaris used his position to protect some Jews by providing them with false documents as supposed agents of the Abwehr, to pass information to the Allies through intermediaries in Spain and Portugal, and to obstruct operations he considered morally unacceptable. The Gestapo, under Müller, suspected Canaris as early as 1943. But Nazi bureaucracy had its own frictions. Himmler, who had his reasons to keep Canaris in office while watching him, initially refused to authorize his arrest. In February 1944, when the Abwehr was absorbed by the RSHA, Canaris's position was irreversibly compromised. He was placed under house arrest. After the July 20, 1944 attempt, when the Gestapo found compromising documents in a safe at the army headquarters in Zossen that directly implicated Canaris, he was arrested and transferred to the Flossenburg camp. He was hanged on April 9, 1945, less than a month before the war's end. The July 20th conspiracy was the closest attempt to success. It involved a network of military personnel, diplomats and civilians, including General Ludwig Beck, former chief of the General Staff, former mayor of Leipzig Karl Goerdeler, who was slated to be the chancellor of the post-Hitler government, and figures like Henning von Tresckow, who had already tried in March 1943 to place a bomb in Hitler's plane disguised as a Cointreau liquor box. The failure of the assassination attempt triggered the largest repressive operation the Gestapo ever carried out on German soil. The conspirators' intelligence apparatus had a fatal weakness. Many had used uncoded phone lines, kept personal diaries, and maintained lists of names. The Gestapo, which had already partially infiltrated several conspiratorial groups before July 20th, used those documents as a roadmap for a manhunt that lasted for months. In total, more than 7,000 people were arrested in the following weeks and months. The numbers of those executed vary depending on the sources, but recent studies estimate that nearly 4,980 people lost their lives as a direct result of the reprisals, including judicial executions, deaths under torture, and forced suicides. The figure far exceeds the 200 mentioned in the original script, which only referred to the most documented and visible executions in the first few days. The Gestapo internally referred to the responsible group as Schwarze Kapelle, the Black Orchestra, and used that label to group together active conspirators, marginal sympathizers, and people who simply knew someone who knew someone. Müller personally directed the investigation. The trials before the Volksgerichtshof, presided over by Roland Freisler, were filmed. Hitler had ordered that the condemned be hanged like cattle. In Plötzensee, executions were carried out with piano wire and butcher hooks in sessions that in some cases lasted up to 20 minutes as cameras recorded every detail. Erwin von Witzleben was executed on August 8, 1944. Karl Goerdeler was hanged on February 2, 1945. Helmuth von Moltke, a descendant of the famous Prussian marshal and a member of the Kreisau Circle, was executed on January 23, 1945, after being arrested simply for a peripheral association with the conspirators. Executions continued until the war's last days. When the Gestapo found Canaris's personal diary in the final weeks of April 1945, it implicated new people who were processed while Berlin burned around them. There were also quieter, less visible forms of resistance than the large conspiracies. The theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a member of the Confessing Church who had refused to accept the Nazification of religious institutions, was arrested on April 5, 1943. He spent nearly 2 years in Tegel prison before being transferred to Flossenburg camp, where he was hanged on April 9, 1945, the same day as Canaris. Sophie and Hans Scholl, students from the University of Munich who distributed leaflets from the White Rose calling for passive resistance, were arrested on February 18, 1943, tried before the People's Court 4 days later, and guillotined that same afternoon. From the moment of their arrest to their execution, less than 100 hours passed. What these stories share is not just the tragic ending, but the clarity with which their protagonists understood the nature of the system they were facing. They knew that the Gestapo made no procedural mistakes that could be overturned on appeal. They knew that an arrest was almost always irreversible, and yet they acted. That decision, made with full knowledge of the consequences, is what makes German resistance historically so significant. It was not impulsive or ignorant. It was deliberate within a system specifically designed to make deliberation impossible. Faced with a bureaucracy built to anticipate and nullify any dissent, there were people who found in that same deliberation the only way to preserve their humanity intact. The collapse, the Gestapo, in the last months of the Reich. In December 1944, Heinrich Himmler told one of his officers that the Ardennes offensive, Germany's final great counterattack on the Western Front, would result in the recapture of Paris before winter was over. This was a statement that no serious military analysis could support. By then, the Soviet army was less than 500 kilometers from Berlin, German cities were being bombed day and night by Allied aviation, and the Reich had lost more than 3.5 million soldiers since 1941. That the Gestapo's operational chief still believed, or pretended to believe, in victory speaks volumes about the state of mind of an apparatus that had functioned for 12 years on the premise that the regime was invincible. The process of disintegration for the Gestapo began earlier than is often recognized. On the morning of February 3, 1945, 1,000 bombers from the 8th Air Force of the United States dropped more than 2,200 tons of bombs over central Berlin, specifically targeting the government district. The number 8 building on Prince Albrechtstrasse was partially destroyed. The main archives had been partially moved to locations outside of Berlin in the previous months, but much of the operational infrastructure was damaged or left incommunicado. Roland Freisler, the judge of the People's Court who had presided over the trials of the July 20th conspirators, died that same day when a building collapsed during a session of the court. The physical eruption of war into the institutions of terror had a brutal logic. By early April 1945, Gestapo officials in regional offices began mass-burning files. In Berlin, the smoke from the documents being incinerated in the courtyards of the Prince Albrechtstrasse building mixed with the smoke of the bombings and blanketed the sky of the capital for days. In other cities, like Munich, Hamburg, and Cologne, the purging of documents began even earlier, when the Allied armies crossed the western borders of the Reich in March. Tons of files, personal records, interrogation records, and lists of informants were deliberately destroyed. Some officials burned the files with bureaucratic precision, cataloguing what they destroyed until the end. Others simply dumped entire drawers into the courtyards and set them on fire. The destruction was not complete. In several cities, the rapid advance of the Allies meant that the Gestapo officials didn't have time to finish their task. In Prague, Vienna, and several cities in Western Germany, the files were partially captured intact. These surviving documents became the primary source for historians studying the inner workings of the institution decades later. In Würzburg, the local office's files survived almost entirely because the official responsible for destroying them had fled before completing the task. These documents, studied by Robert Gelately and other researchers, revealed with unique precision the day-to-day mechanics of terror on a provincial scale. The personnel of the Gestapo reacted to the collapse of the regime in ways that reflected the moral diversity of the organization. Some officials simply changed their clothes, threw away their credentials, and blended into the civilian population before the Allies arrived. Others continued arresting and executing until the very last days. In the final weeks of April 1945, when Berlin was already being attacked from all fronts, The Gestapo was still processing cases of defeatism and cowardice in the face of the enemy. Soldiers who had abandoned their positions, civilians who had raised white flags in their windows, and officials who had attempted to surrender prematurely were executed in the streets by SS units and Gestapo agents who continued to function as an extension of an authority that was disintegrating in real time. Himmler starred in one of the most revealing episodes about the nature of the regime in those final days. In April 1945, behind Hitler's back, he attempted to negotiate surrender with the Western Allies through Count Volker Bernadotte, a representative of the Swedish Red Cross. When Hitler was informed of the betrayal, he expelled Himmler from all his posts and ordered his arrest. The man who had built the most efficient repressive apparatus in modern history ended his days disguised as a police sergeant with an eye patch trying to cross Allied lines incognito. He was arrested by British soldiers on May 22, 1945, at a roadblock in Bremervörde. 2 days later, on May 23, 1945, he bit down on a cyanide capsule hidden between his teeth while being examined by a military doctor. He died within 20 minutes. Müller disappeared. He was the last person seen in the Führer bunker during the final days of Berlin. Hitler's secretary, Traudl Junge, recalled seeing him on April 22nd. The telephone operator Rokus Misch claimed to have seen him on April 30th, the same day as Hitler's suicide. After that, nothing. His body was never found with verifiable certainty. For decades, theories circulated about his fate, that he had escaped to Argentina like other Nazi criminals, that he had been recruited by Soviet intelligence, which would explain his disappearance and the Soviet silence about it, or that he died in the fighting in Berlin and was buried in an unmarked grave. In 1963, German authorities officially declared his death, but without conclusive evidence. No court ever tried him. No court ever pronounced his name in a judgment. Adolf Eichmann, the official who had coordinated the deportation of millions of Jews from his office within the Gestapo apparatus, managed to escape to Argentina using documents from the International Red Cross with a false identity. He lived in Buenos Aires under the name Ricardo Clement for 15 years. In May 1960, Mossad agents identified him, captured him in the town of San Fernando, and clandestinely transferred him to Israel. He was tried in Jerusalem in 1961, sentenced to death, and executed by hanging on June 1, 1962. His ashes were scattered in the Mediterranean Sea outside Israel's territorial waters, so that there would be no place where he could become an object of veneration. The institutional apparatus of the Gestapo was officially dissolved on May 7, 1945, when the German High Command signed the unconditional surrender in Reims. During the Nuremberg trials, which began in November of that year, the Gestapo was declared a criminal organization along with the SS and SD. The tribunal ruled that anyone who had been a voluntary member of the organization after September 1, 1939, the date the war began, could be prosecuted individually for war crimes or crimes against humanity. It was the first time in history that an entire institution, not just its leaders, was declared criminally responsible. What the file couldn't erase: trace, trials, and the model that survived. Of the approximately 32,000 officials that the Gestapo had at its peak expansion in 1944, the proportion that faced concrete legal consequences after the war was insignificant. The Nuremberg trials between 1945 and 1949 prosecuted a total of 185 people, including subsequent trials. In the Federal Republic of Germany, the Zentrale Stelle der Landesjustizverwaltungen, the Central Office for Investigating Nazi Crimes established in Ludwigsburg in 1958, opened thousands of investigations in the following decades, but firm convictions remained proportionally scarce. Many former Gestapo officials had built new identities, found jobs in the public administration of post-war Germany, or simply lived in their hometowns with a discretion that no one bothered to interrupt. The most revealing case of this structural impunity was that of former Gestapo officials who re-entered German state service during the 1950s. When the Bundesnachrichtendienst, BND, the Federal Intelligence Service of the Federal Republic, was established in 1956 under the direction of Reinhard Gehlen, a former general of the Nazi military intelligence on the Eastern Front, It incorporated dozens of former members of the SS, Gestapo, and SD as analysts and operatives. The Cold War logic provided a pragmatic justification. These men had experience in counterintelligence and knowledge of Soviet networks that no recruit without experience could replicate. The anti-communism that had motivated many of them to serve the Nazi regime made them, in the context of the confrontation with the Soviet Union, useful assets. The surviving Gestapo files later became the foundation for the most rigorous historiography of the Third Reich. The documents from the Würzburg office, studied by Robert Gelatelli and published in his book The Gestapo and German Society in 1990, demolished the myth of the omniscient and omnipresent police. What the files revealed was an institution that depended heavily on civilian collaboration, had limited human resources, and functioned more as a processor of denunciations than as an active surveillance network. This historical revision was uncomfortable for the narrative many Germans had constructed about the period. If the Gestapo depended on citizens to function, then the responsibility for terror could not be confined to a criminal elite. It was distributed. Historians Klaus Michael Malmann and political scientist Gerhard Pohl, in their 1993 study of the Gestapo in the Saarland, deepened this analysis by documenting how the organization operated in a specific region with a density of personnel that made systematic surveillance impossible. In the Saarland, with a population of nearly 1 million inhabitants, the Gestapo had only about 50 full-time employees. Its actual operational capacity was minimal. Its psychological impact, however, was disproportionate. This gap between the institutional reality and the social perception of terror is one of the most studied phenomena in Nazi historiography, precisely because it raises questions that transcend the German case. The Gestapo files from Vienna, partly destroyed and partly recovered, were studied in depth by historians Hans Safrian and Hans Wittek, whose work revealed the specificity of persecution in Austria. Viennese anti-Semitism had different roots than in Germany, more visceral, more openly violent in the early weeks of the Anschluss, and with more immediate popular participation. Surviving records show that in Vienna, during the first months of 1938, many Jewish arrests were initiated by neighbors who took advantage of the chaos of the Anschluss to seize apartments, businesses, or goods from their victims. Racial persecution and economic opportunism often operated in parallel, frequently driven by the same individuals. In Israel, Adolf Eichmann's trial in 1961 produced one of the most influential philosophical analyses on the nature of bureaucratic terror. Philosopher Hannah Arendt, who covered the trial for the New Yorker magazine, coined the term "the banality of evil" in her book Eichmann in Jerusalem to describe how Eichmann, and by extension, many Gestapo officials and Nazi apparatus members in general, were not sadistic monsters but mediocre bureaucrats who had found in the institutional structure the justification for executing acts of unprecedented monstrosity. They didn't think, Arendt argued. They followed procedures. The thesis was, and still is, controversial, but it articulated something that the Gestapo files confirmed from another angle. The most efficient terror does not require fanatics. It requires functionaries. The control technology developed by the Gestapo, the individual file as a tool of power, surveillance based on citizen denunciations, preventive custody without judicial process, collaboration between civil and police agencies to track individuals, was studied after the war by intelligence services on both sides of the Iron Curtain. The Stasi, the secret police of the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, established in 1950, incorporated many of these operational principles and refined them with incomparably larger human resources. It came to have 91,000 official employees and approximately 174,000 unofficial informants to control a population of 16 million people. The agent-to-citizen ratio of the Stasi far exceeded that of the Gestapo, but the conceptual model, turning society into its own surveillance network, was the same. The debates about the collective responsibility of German society in the functioning of the Gestapo continued for decades after the war. The thesis of American historian Daniel Jonah Goldhagen, published in Hitler's Willing Executioners in 1996, argued that eliminationist anti-Semitism was so deeply rooted in German culture that participation in terror did not require coercion. The thesis was strongly contested by historians like Christopher Browning, whose study of the Reserve Police Battalion 101, Ordinary Men, 1992, demonstrated that the men who participated in mass executions in Poland were not ideological fanatics, but middle-aged workers who had the opportunity to refuse and did not, partly due to social conformity and partly due to group dynamics that turned individual refusal into an act of betrayal to their comrades. Both theses, differing in their conclusions, agreed on one point: the Nazi repressive apparatus could not have functioned without the active or passive participation of ordinary citizens. The Gestapo was the central node of this system, but it was not its only component. It worked because a sufficient number of people fed it with information, tolerated it with silence, or simply looked the other way. That distribution of responsibility is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of its legacy. It does not point to an elite of identifiable monsters, but to the general human capacity to normalize participation in systems of terror when the social, ideological, and institutional context makes it the expected behavior. The 2.5 million files that the Gestapo had accumulated by 1938 represented something more than police data. They represented the map of fear in a society. Each file was the trace of a monitored conversation, an intercepted letter, a denunciation between neighbors, or a night of interrogation in a basement without windows. Many of these files burned in the courtyards of Prince Albrechtstrasse in April 1945. Others survived and became evidence. But what no file can fully capture is the invisible damage the system produced to the trust between people, to the willingness to speak, to dissent, or to imagine that things could be different. That damage did not end with the war. It took generations to heal, and in some respects historians still debate whether it ever fully healed.